Welcome back to Authors and Innovators. I'm Larry Gennari. Thank you for spending some of your time with us. If you enjoy these books, please visit the link below and support our independent bookseller, Nantucket Book Partners. Thanks too to our sponsors. Needham & Company is our presenting sponsor. They're a globally recognized investment banking and asset management firm focused solely on growth companies and their investors. Founded in 1985, the firm is headquartered in New York with offices in Boston, Chicago, Minneapolis, San Francisco, and in Menlo Park. I also want to thank Launchpad Venture Group, a network of active angel investors building individual portfolios by investing both financial and human capital in New England area startups. The Boston Business Journal, our current and continuing sponsor, and of course our host, Babson College and the Arthur M. Blank School for Entrepreneurial Leadership.
Hey, this is Christopher Mirabile here with a tip. I run Launchpad Venture Group, and I'm here to say some supportive words about this Authors and Innovators program. It's a fantastic program. We've participated in it before and are proud to be alongside Babson as a sponsor this year. What I like best about this program is that I discover books I hadn't yet heard about, and better yet, I get to get the author's take on it. I found it fascinating to go through that process when we were participating a couple of years ago with our Entrepreneur's Journey book, which we released about 24 months ago now. And having to sort of boil the whole book down into a short conversation made it, I think, really accessible for the readers, and it led to a lot of really interesting engagement. So as someone who participates in the Boston innovation ecosystem, Launchpad Venture Group is a large 175 investor group that backs early stage startups from Babson and other places. I find this kind of program to be absolutely essential for making those connections, finding those ideas, and getting out there and mixing it up. So check it out at authorsinnovators.org. It's a terrific program. You can go for the entire program, or you can pick different sessions that you want to see. Can't say enough good things about this program, and I'm proud to be a sponsor and to be affiliated. Best of luck. Thank you.
Today we'll talk about reclaiming. You had those superpowers all along. And we'll start with the book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, by Cornell professor Vanessa Bohns. We're going to continue our conversation today about post-pandemic entrepreneurialism and what's in store for you and how can you rebuild and renew and today reclaiming those important superpowers. And here today to talk with us about this is Dr. Vanessa Bohns, author of the terrific book, You Have More Influence Than You Think, How We Underestimate Our Power of Persuasion and Why It Matters. And Vanessa is a social psychologist and also a professor of organizational behavior at Cornell. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications, and she has been featured by the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and one of my very favorite shows, NPR's Hidden Brain. So welcome, Vanessa. So pleased that you're here. And I always like to start these good conversations with asking our authors to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about how you got here to this area of study and this wonderful book.
Yeah, it's funny hearing myself introduced as a professor at Cornell always reminds me of sort of how far I've come, because I never expected that when I was growing up. I grew up on a farm. My dad was a mechanic. He had never gone to college. And so the idea of being a professor at a college was just sort of not even on my radar many years ago. But I wound up going to Brown and getting my PhD at Columbia. And I think through that kind of suffered from a fair amount of imposter syndrome, not surprisingly. And I think part of that is maybe what led me to where I am today, where a lot of what I study as an experimental social psychologist is the ways in which we underestimate ourselves, the ways in which we tend to think that, we aren't impacting people or having impact in the world, influencing people, that people are judging us more harshly than they actually are. And I think that really kind of gave me a lens to sort of see the world that I started to notice pretty early on in grad school.
I love that. I love that part of your background. And your dad, as a tradesperson, it must have been. Few people are better at sizing up people than perhaps mechanics. And I'm sure over the years that must have been a source of endless entertainment, because I bet he had plenty of stories. And I bet you sort of heard from plenty of folks. And I also wanted to get back to your mechanical breakdown that you talk a little bit about in the book. So early in the book, you talk about something you just mentioned, which is this sort of, I think you called it the underestimation of compliance effect. And you started with asking students to go out and learn for themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's, as you said, it's called the underestimation of compliance effect, which is a bit of a mouthful for something that is so simple, which is basically just the idea that people are more willing to do things for us than we think when we ask them to do something. And I initially discovered this in graduate school. As I said, early on in my graduate career, I feel like I kind of had this lens where I was attuned to things like this. And I was running a study where I had to go up to people in Penn Station and ask them to fill out a questionnaire. And I found doing this study so distressing, because the idea of approaching people in Penn Station, strangers, asking them for something was just truly sort of traumatizing.
It is unsettling, isn't it?
About it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was very anxiety provoking, and I was so worried that they were going to be mad or, clearly reject me, and maybe even do something worse, yell at me, I didn't know what. But what I found, along with a professor I was working with at the time, Frank Flynn, was that people were actually pretty quick to agree, more than I expected. And so, as you said, I wanted to see, is that just me, or is that true for most people? And so I brought students into the lab following that experience and had them do the same thing I did in Penn Station. We would give them different favors to ask of strangers. We would have them predict how many people would say yes before they asked strangers these requests. And then they would keep track of how many people actually said yes. And what we found is that they also greatly underestimated by about twice as much how many people would say no to them. Basically, they expected to be rejected twice as much as they actually were.
And one of the basic parts, basic foundations of the book, which I really liked, was telling your readers, get out of your own head and stop thinking that way and try to put yourself in the position of the folks who might be asked, why do we do this fundamentally? Because we've both, I'm sure, had situations, even today, where you mention something to someone and say, no, I'm not doing that. No way am I doing that. Why do we, on both ends, Vanessa, why do we hesitate to do it? And why, on the other side of that, are we more inclined to say, yeah, okay, I'll do that?
Yeah, when we ask for things, we are really kind of trying to avoid rejection. As much as we want a thing, we hate being rejected, right? And so that fear of rejection really colors everything. And if we overestimate that likelihood of rejection, then we hesitate and we hold back. But what's so interesting is, just like we hate to be rejected and have this fear and anxiety about being rejected that suggests we're kind of being socially excluded in some way, the person on the other side hates doing the rejecting just as much. So when you're on the other side, if you kind of flip the script and imagine if someone's asking you for a favor, right, you don't want to feel like a jerk by saying no. You don't want to, basically tell this person that, you don't want to help them out, that your relationship isn't as strong as maybe you thought. You don't want to reject them and therefore kind of push them away socially. And we tend to forget that when we're in the perspective of asking. So it turns out people say no less because it's just really hard to say no. But we don't realize that when we're doing the asking.
So true. And I loved the example you gave of the compliment exercise. And it reminded me of that Maya Angelou quote, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's so true, isn't it? Talk a bit about the exercise you did with compliments, because I think that's a really fun part of the book.
That is so true, and that is such a wonderful quote that now I wish I had put in the book, because that really does express this so well. So, I mentioned we brought people into the lab and had them ask for things in previous studies, but then in later studies, we decided to bring people into the lab and have them give people things. And as you said, the things they gave people were compliments. And what we found is that when we ask people in advance, how good do you think this compliment will make someone feel? And then we had them just go out and compliment random strangers. It turns out that when we asked those strangers how they actually felt, they felt a lot happier and more flattered by that compliment than our participants expected. And part of it was that they were so worried that they were going to give this bumbling, awkward, incompetent sort of compliment, when in fact, as you said, no one cares about that. They don't care about being, interrupted or how awkward you might have delivered it. It's how it makes you feel, and it just feels good to be complimented.
And what I like about it, to bring this to our business audience here at Babson and beyond, this book has real implications for management of a company. If you're a manager, if you're a CEO trying to hire folks in a challenging time, what would you say to those folks who are managing talent? Why is it, and who might ask you, why is it so hard to ask people to do things? I'm talking to this person, I really want them to excel in our organization, but I got to get them to a point where they can do something that's going to be useful and advance the organization. Why is that so hard? Is it because we don't approach it the right way, Vanessa, in terms of thinking through, gee, they're going to reject this advice, I need to compliment them? What would you say to a manager listening to us today about, just give me some basic tips. How can I get people to do things? How can I build a cohesive team? What are the kind of things that you would, because I know you talk about many of these tips in the book, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. Some are these sort of mistaken assumptions we have about other people. One of them is that we tend to assume that other people are sort of more ready to push back against us than they actually are. So we think we need to push really hard to get somebody to do something for us, when in fact, people are not inclined to immediately push back. We tend to be more inclined to go along with something. We're open to what someone has to say for the most part, right, before they actually come out and say it. And I think often we just assume the worst, and that actually leads us to communicate in suboptimal ways, right? We push too hard, or we're not direct about what we want someone to do. So I'd say being not too aggressive, but at the same time being quite direct about what you need from someone is kind of the great moderate way of getting someone to do something. I think another mistake that managers and people in positions where they're, in leadership or management positions tend to make is that we think it's all about the tangible incentives. We think people are in things for the money, and that if we can't offer them sort of bonuses and monetary rewards and tangible incentives, that we can't get them to move or do things for us. But in fact, we find in our research, and other people have found, that a kind word or recognition can be just as important as tangible incentives.
Wow.
And also that people are just as likely to do things because they want to help you out as they are if they're getting something in return.
Great advice. Great advice. And you have a great example of that in the book. You and your husband, you had the kids in the car, and you had a problem with the tire on a holiday weekend. And tell that story briefly, because it's a great example of what you just said, that you don't have to shower someone with money. They'll do it if you ask in the right way and with the right context.
Yeah, this example is so funny because it happened to us, and we made the same mistakes that I see all my participants make all the time. So as you said, it was 4th of July weekend. Everyone knows how busy that kind of travel weekend is. It's hot. We have 2 toddlers in the back seat, and all of a sudden we notice the sound coming from our tire, and it turns out there is a screw stuck in the tire. So we realize this, and we're not sure what to do. We try to find a shop somewhere in the area. We're in this tiny town. We have like 4 hours left to go or something. And it turns out, as we look on our phones, that the shop is just closed. So we're like, okay, let's just drive by and see if maybe the hours are different, or maybe they're still open for some reason. So we drive by the shop. It's not too far away. And indeed, the hours on the door say that it's closed, but we see the mechanic still in there in the garage. And so my husband rolls down the window and he says, "Hey, are you closed?" And the guy says, "Yep." And my husband proceeds to roll the window back up. And I'm like, wait. So he's totally thinking like done. And I was like, let's just ask him for what we actually need, right? And so he unrolls the window again and says, "We have a screw stuck in our tire. It should be a really quick fix. Is there any way that you'd be able to help us out?" And he says, "We'll pay you twice the amount that, you would normally charge."
Right.
So the guy comes up and he says, "Of course," and he does it. It takes 5 minutes. He's happy to do it. He doesn't charge us anything because he's just happy to sort of
Such a great example.
help somebody out. Yeah. So it was such a great example of a situation where we assumed that it was a no, sort of going into it. We pre-assumed that rejection, but in fact, once we asked, the person was happy to do it.
I love that example. There's also another one when you talk about having somebody go downstairs and talk to a security guard and say, "Hey, could I have $50?" And the security guard isn't insulted so much and they say what instead? They say,
"Yeah." They say, "Why?"
"Yeah, why?" I love that example. Not "No, that's ridiculous. Get out of my face." Why? So they're engaging, and I think your book really convinced me and underscored your great argument that, look, sometimes you can ask. This is what it is to be a human in the world. And you gave this great example of choking. So as a public service announcement, tell all of our entrepreneurs, CEOs, and students who are listening about that.
Yeah, and this example is given because we tend to dismiss the power of embarrassment. We think that, why would anyone, do something crazy out of embarrassment, like say yes to something that they don't really want to do, which is what we find in many of our studies, that people find it really hard to say no, in part because they're so embarrassed and it's such an awkward situation. So one example of this is actually, and this kind of gets at how powerful embarrassment is in life, is when you're at the dinner table with a group of people and you start to choke, right? Many people's initial inclination is to immediately stand up and leave the table, because they're so embarrassed. They don't want to be,
Right.
looking like that in front of that group of people. But of course, once you stand up and leave the table, you've just left all those people there who could have helped you if you were choking. And so people wind up, going to the bathroom and having trouble there, and sometimes even choking to death because they just wanted to exit that
Because they're
situation.
embarrassed.
It's so embarrassing.
Wow. I would just, it's such an example that really sticks in my head. And let's talk a little bit more about some of these other contexts that you provide space for. So someone asking folks internally, we had a lot of talk about masking and vaccines. How do you deal with that, Vanessa, when you're saying, I don't want to insult someone, but I really want them to wear a mask? I've got an immunocompromised person at home or something like that. I'll talk about those kind of situations where it is embarrassing to ask and you don't want someone to be embarrassed to say no, but you got to have what you need to be safe.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is such an important context that so many of us are dealing with right now. And I think the first thing is not to, again, pre-assume why someone isn't doing something, right? So I think starting from a place that maybe this person isn't wearing a mask because they forgot, right? It's not always true, right? But maybe. And don't just assume that it's for some reason where they're just going to, yell at you if you were to ask. And then the next thing that I usually suggest is to be prepared. So one reason that those interactions are so difficult is because we can't find the words. In the moment, it's so awkward and uncomfortable, and we don't want to make it weird, and we don't want to offend the other person, and we don't know exactly what to say. And so if you sort of have a script that if I encounter this situation, here's what I'm going to say, that can be really useful. And then, of course, you want to know, well, what can that script say where I don't offend the other person, but I still get, as you said, what I need or what I want, right? And basically you want to do two things. You want to save face for the other person because it is really awkward and embarrassing to be called out, especially on something that a lot of people have moralized at this point, right? So they worry, they worry that you're basically saying like, you're a bad person, right? I don't like you, and that's why I'm saying something. So you want to convey like, you're not a bad person. I do like you, right? We're good, you're good. But then you also want to be really clear about what you need them to do. So, but I need you to put on your mask, right? And that request is really hard for them to say no to. And if you've prefaced it with this idea of like, I'm not calling you a bad person, I'm saving face for you, usually people are more receptive to it.
I like the idea of sort of picking up this theme of asking for what you need. So for those founders, for those management teams who are listening to this and saying, I'm about to make an investor pitch. Should we ask for this? How should we ask it? What broad advice, other than, hey, you've got to get the book and read it, what would you tell them, Vanessa, before they go into that investor pitch, whether it's one person or a group? And does that matter? A venture group or a person?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the biggest things that people do is they negotiate themselves down before they ask for something.
Right.
Again, they assume that someone's not going to be receptive to a certain amount or a certain kind of request. And so you kind of talk yourself down. So, and I actually, in a few examples I give of university deans who ask donors for upwards of millions of dollars. There are actual deans who do this kind of fundraising, right, who aren't trained in it, but are put in these situations, who go into situations with donors where they do this, where they think they're going to ask for $1 million, but instead they ask for less. All of a sudden, they negotiate themselves down. So I'd say know what you need, right, set that goal and ask for that first. And don't assume in advance that someone's immediately going to reject that.
So get out of your own head, which is such great advice. Don't assume, because otherwise you're having this negotiation with yourself, which is interesting. Does it matter, Vanessa, whether that is a one-on-one conversation or with a few people? So if I'm going to, our entrepreneurs are going to meet with a venture group, and there'll be 4 people in the room versus just talking one-on-one to one particular angel investor. Does that dynamic matter?
I think it's a lot easier to control the situation clearly if it's one other person, right? Because if you are in a room and you're asking one person face-to-face something, it's hard for them to say no. But if you're kind of making a request to the group, you get all sorts of groupie issues now. You get people, one person might be not so sure, and now that's affecting the rest of the group and their opinion. And maybe now they feel emboldened to say no more than if it was just a one-on-one conversation. So I do think it affects the dynamics. I don't really know exactly how. I think it could go a lot of different ways.
Yeah. But one thing you do tell folks is, even now where we're living in this post-pandemic era, you like in person instead of just on email. And you talk a bit about that, and it's very convincing. You can sit down and craft the most cogent email, but maybe you should be either picking up the phone, doing it on Zoom, or ideally being in front of that person.
That's absolutely true. And it's funny because when we ask people what they think is going to be the most effective way to ask for something, they don't really see a big difference between, as you said, crafting that perfect email where I can get my argument, just right, and someone's going to read it and it's going to be totally convincing, or just walking into someone's office, ideally, and, talking to them right there. Maybe you won't say everything perfectly, but you're still in that face-to-face environment. And what we find is that face-to-face is just worlds more effective than email.
So important. And it's interesting you talk about BSing in here and why we indulge in it and why people tend to, everybody recognizes it for what it is. I liked your examples about politicians using different language when they think they're talking to a friendly audience. Can you talk a little bit about reclaiming authenticity and trying to avoid some of the things that you point out in the book that people are going to know? You're talking to you gave a great example on both sides of both Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton as presidential candidates committing what later were recognized as unfortunate comments or gaffes. Can you talk a little bit about folks who might indulge in that and say, look, be your authentic self in every meeting?
Yeah, the interesting thing that we find in the research is this thing called audience tuning. And you think of it as this motivated, manipulative kind of thing that's really inauthentic, right? And we think if people kind of give a slightly different pitch to one group that it's, that they must be sort of lying or just totally being manipulative if they give a different pitch to another group. But in fact, it's actually part of natural human communication.
We just do it, right?
We just do it. Yeah, we want other people to like us, whether it's, people we want to vote for us or give us money, or whether it's just, a person we want to have a nice conversation with. And so for example, if I know that you really love this restaurant I went to last night, right, but I wasn't so keen on it, I'm not going to say that restaurant was crap. I'm sorry. Was terrible.
Yeah.
I'll probably, tune my message a little bit to you and say like, that the restaurant was okay, right? I'll make it sound a little better because I want us to have a nice conversation. I want you to like me.
So I want to give folks, and I don't want to give away the book because I do want them to buy the book by clicking on the links that we have below. But you talk about 3 goals for getting better at seeing, feeling, and experiencing our own influence. Can you sum that up? And I know we won't do it justice in the time we have, but what are those 3 goals, and how quickly should we expect to be able to be exercising the influence that we think we should have?
Yeah, and the idea here is to start to take stock of the influence you already have before you start like looking for all these tips and tricks to gain influence, right? Part of it is starting to see the effect that you already have.
So look around.
And that really is about what you mentioned earlier, getting out of your own head, right? When we're in our own head, we see how other people affect us. We see how they're impacting one another. What we don't see in that scene when we're looking out through our own 2 eyes is ourselves and how we're impacting the situation. So kind of practicing exercises that get you out of your own head to see the things you do that people might be responding to. Another piece, as you said, is not just seeing, but also feeling your influence. And that means sometimes you can sort of see yourself in the picture, like maybe I made this face, maybe I said this comment, and that impacted other people, but you don't really know how they felt about it. And that's because often when we try to figure out how someone else feels, we are still stuck in our own heads, right, and drawing on our own experiences, which may not match other people's. So another way to sort of get insight into your own influence is to get perspective, as my colleagues would say. So instead of just taking perspective, which is like trying to figure out what someone else is thinking, actually get perspective. Ask someone what they're thinking, get new information. And the last one is experiencing. And that really refers to sort of testing it out. Right? So that time that my husband and I had a screw in our tire, we just tested it out and it turned out, oh, wow, people are willing to do things. So the more you sort of engage with these opportunities to exercise your influence, especially when it's not going to be harmful for anybody and it's actually going to be beneficial for everybody, the more you sort of see the impact that you can have on other people and in the world.
I love that framework. So tell us, what else are you reading these days? And if particularly if somebody enjoyed this book, what are you reading, and what do you think people should read other than this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you enjoyed this book, Heidi Grant has this book called Reinforcements that came out a couple years ago, all about how you get people to help you, which is a wonderful sort of comparison to that book, and they go together nicely as a pair. And then I actually am a big fan of Anne Lamott, who wrote Bird by Bird.
Yeah.
If you want an amazing book on writing, that's just incredible. And it's not just about writing, it's also about life. So I highly recommend that.
I love that one too. Vanessa Bohns, thank you so much for joining us. The book is You Have More Influence Than You Think. I hope everyone listening will have a chance to take a look. Are there any other places where folks can get information about you and learn more about the book? A website? Anything else you want to mention to folks as we finish up our discussion?
Sure. So I have a website that is vanessabohns.com. And again, Bohns is Bohns. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Prof. Bohns.
Outstanding. Vanessa, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Again, the book is You Have More Influence Than You Think. Take a look, read it, and you will too. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, welcome to Authors and Innovators 2021. I'm Caitlin McCulley, and I'm joined by Stacey Borden. Stacey is the Executive Director of New Beginnings Reentry Services in Roxbury. Stacey, welcome. It's good to meet you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to meet you.
So we know there are many paths to entrepreneurship, and some of them are unexpected. There's not just like this one right way to run a business. And so I'm curious to learn more about your journey and how you got to the work that you're doing now.
Well, it started, I think, back in 2010. I am a formerly incarcerated woman sitting in the cell in Framingham State Prison. I started really realizing that all the women that I had spent years with in and out of the prison continued to come back after many years on, after being released on parole. And I felt something was wrong with that. It was almost an awakening for me. And really starting to read some of the women's um, paperwork and some of their litigation, some of their trial transcripts, I said, wow, a lot of us had come from sexual and domestic violence. And why are we being prosecuted and sentenced without sending us to treatment and healing centers? And so that began my journey to come out. I made a promise back to the girls that I was going to get out and do something different and help them on their journey upon their release. And so that's what I did. I went on this journey of education and became a master level clinician. Found my mentor, Andrea James of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. And she said, hey, I need you to take this class with Professor Gianari over there at Babson College. And I took that course. And so the dream that I had sitting in that cell just came alive, just like that, through his course.
Wow. A lot of people, it's one thing to see a problem and see an issue and know that it's a problem that needs to be solved. And it's an entirely different thing to decide to go after it and everything that's involved in doing that. Was there one moment for you where you said, you know what, enough of this, I want to try to be a part of the solution? Or was it more of a gradual understanding that you wanted to do this?
I think that it was in me from growing up. My dad was also a director of Roxbury Detox, that he came out of his alcoholism and developed his program and became a counselor. And then he didn't want to be a director. So it kind of unfolded. It just flopped. And so through that process, I think it was in me. I just didn't know it. And so really developing it through mentorship of Andrea James, mentorship of the National Council of Women. I also belong to Families for Justice as Healing, which is a community-based program that fights for women's rights. So it was an accumulation of stuff that just cultivated and blossomed into, I can do my small part of reentry treatment element of counseling the women and giving them a broader idea of meeting themselves and really coming into their own maturated state and figuring out what they want to do in their life. And so that is my giving back to community and society.
Where did you start with this? It seems like this is such a complex problem and unique to every individual. Where did you start? How did you get started?
Yeah, so I took little steps. I came out of prison, as I said, in 2010. I went right into Cambridge College, which was a phenomenal experience. Cambridge College really heard my cry, my need to be educated in the world of trauma and addiction. What happened to me? Why was I so involved in addictive behaviors and not really realizing that the addiction or the drugs was just a small part of my problem? I needed to address the trauma in my behavior. And they brought me into the world of education, presentation, really having a voice in a leadership role. And so I just kept taking courses. I just kept raising my hand, asking questions. And I just kept saying, take me there. I want to do something different. I want to develop a program that's different than, often the fundamental programs that we have available of halfway houses. We needed something innovative. And so they heard my dream. They kept pushing me. I got my master's in 2016, and then I launched New Beginnings Reentry Services.
Wow. And I mean, if there's one thing that I've learned about entrepreneurship so far, it's that uncertainty is guaranteed. And so, that's a known. Given this last year, which threw a curveball in every business, no matter, what line of work you're in, how did you adapt to the unique challenges of the pandemic?
Well, that was a deep challenge. I mean, as soon as I took the course with Professor Gianari, and we had I don't even know how to explain the miracle of a couple that was in the audience that said, we will help you and purchase the home so you can do this reentry residential program. As soon as we closed on the property, the pandemic happened, and we had, everybody was at a halt. And so that was my way of really understanding, fiduciary responsibility as a CEO of your own company, how to really develop board development. Do I need a consultant? Do I need someone with grant writing? I mean, when I tell you that this took me into a whole different realm of understanding the world of policies and procedures, construction codes and compliances, city fire codes and compliances, and really trying to get the needs of American Disabilities Act, doing handicap accessibility for the women. And so I just dived in and used that time to even learn what fundraising, corporate sponsorship, grant writing was all about. And who knew that through George Floyd's death, there were people out there that was really hearing. It was almost like the universe stopped everybody and said, the world has to change now. We have to do something different. We have to really dive in and do what Andrea James always says, reimagine the communities. And people in the world were out there supportive of our need. And so we were able to raise enough money to do the construction to get the house in its proper code and compliances to house 10 women coming out of prison. And since it's lifted, we're about to open up those doors.
Wow. When do you expect to open?
We're hoping to open the end of October, waiting for the occupancy license.
Wow. Well, you mentioned the pandemic causing people to kind of reimagine their lives going forward, reevaluate their goals, if they're meeting them, if they're not. What advice would you have for any entrepreneurs who maybe want to go in that direction, but are in another job right now, but this pandemic has caused them to be curious about entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think that, I always say I don't give advice. I can make all the suggestions in the world and people can run with it and, just follow your dream. If you have the idea, if you really want to contribute to humanity and understand that we should be building a whole new community, for me as an abolitionist, a world without prisons. And so buckle down, dive in, take courses, learn what business entrepreneurship is, learn how to be a director of your life and then the lives of others, and be creative with it. And just know that people are out here in need. People are suffering and mental health issues are happening. Substance abuse is on the rise. We have a whole epidemic within the pandemic. And take some courses. Take the suggestion from people like me that have been there and have really created something different. And so I say that to a lot of our women and some of the men that come out of the prison system. Take Gianari's course. Professor Gianari has it. He gets it. And so, that's the only suggestion that I can give. Really believe that dreams can come true.
Well, Stacey, you're an inspiration for many other women. I know there's people listening to this as well as the women that you're helping. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing your story and making it possible for all of these other women that you're helping to have their stories turn out maybe differently than they imagined also.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And for you guys watching, there'll be more interviews with authors and innovators coming up later this week. And if you're curious to learn more about any of the books we may have mentioned, we've got a link to the independent bookseller on your screen. Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Delighted to continue our conversation about rethinking, renewing, today reclaiming. You had these superpowers all along. So I'm really pleased that our guest today is Stacey Vanek Smith, and she's going to talk about her wonderful new book, Machiavelli for Women: Defend Your Growth, Grow Your Ambition, and Win the Workplace. Stacey really needs no introduction to so many in our audience. She's a longtime public radio reporter and host. She currently hosts NPR's The Indicator from Planet Money, and of course you've heard her on Planet Money as well as Marketplace. Stacey, welcome. And I'm pleased that people get to, in addition to sort of seeing you and hearing your voice, they get to see you. So welcome to Authors and Innovators. Tell us a bit about you that we might not have known. You grew up in Idaho. How did that bring you? How did that bring you? What was that experience like, and how did it bring you to where you are today?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really thrilled to be here. It is funny to be on camera so much these days. I'm used to microphones and soundproof booths. Yes, you're right. I grew up in Idaho all the way through my senior year of high school. I grew up in Boise. My parents had a cattle ranch outside of Boise in a little town called Ola, and I grew up working on the ranch. How did it shape me? I mean, how didn't it shape me? I think I've always, well, one of the big ways I think is having, I feel like in Idaho, I was very much outside of the sort of world that I'm in now, like on the outside of like journalism and sort of the levers of power. Idaho is, it's a very agricultural community. It's a very independent, like the culture is very independent. People are very proud. They're very self-sufficient. And so I always felt, and I think continue to feel maybe a little bit like an outsider in certain ways in journalism and in the world of business and economics. I actually think that's been an advantage for me. I always approach things. I mean, for a journalist to be a little bit of an outsider, I feel like journalists always are. And it does help powers of observation because things are new, you know, they're not familiar. And I for years in my career, felt very out of place. You know, I mean, I felt like I had weird cultural things from being from the West, from being sort of from a very rural area and sort of a remote location that people make fun of. And I still remember the first time I heard the term flyover state.
Right.
What?
Right. And it feels like it shaped this book now that I'm hearing this. So you talk a bit about what brought you to Machiavelli. You started as a radio producer and wanted to do something different.
Yes. So I started out in journalism as a producer. I was working on the graveyard shift at Marketplace, and I knew I wanted to be on the air. I loved radio. I loved listening to the radio. I loved hearing stories. I loved the intimacy of the medium, getting to hear people's voices. You can tell so much about a person when you hear their voice. You can hear their emotions, if they're thinking or not. There's so much that you can hear in someone's voice. And we're so trained, so hyper trained from birth really to understand the minor tones in people's voices. So radio for me is just like such a wonderful medium. I knew I wanted to be on the air. But even getting that first job as a producer on the graveyard shift was such a journey for me. It was very hard for me to get into journalism at first. Because I just didn't understand how. There was no reason for the difficulty other than I just didn't understand how things worked. I thought when a job was posted, you just sent your resume in. And I think even starting from there and kind of learning how things worked was a really important first lesson. And I feel like I've kind of kept learning. I am still learning how to function in the workplace and be a colleague and, all those things.
What an authentic place to start with Machiavelli, because what I'm hearing is some of the same themes, right, from the book. And you talk about inheriting versus conquering princes in the context of Machiavelli. And so what I'm hearing is someone who thought that way, and this feels a bit like a letter to your earlier self.
Oh, I haven't thought about it that way, but I think it very much is. I spent a lot of time during the course of writing this book thinking about and sort of wincing a little, if I'm honest, about early episodes in my career.
Oh, you were so candid. I loved it. And our readers will too, because you're so authentic through it. But you're right. you did some very authentic sharing in here.
Authentic is a very kind and gentle word for the sometimes disastrous workplace decisions I made, often because emotion would take over for me. I care so much about my work. I always have. It's a big part of my life. I feel very invested. The workplace is a personal place. Right. People are like, oh, this is work. It's different. But work is a part of our life. We spend, many of us, 8 hours a day or more. We spend a lot of our lives here. A lot of the relationships are very meaningful. They definitely are for me. And so I think learning to enjoy the emotional aspect of work and also learning to be more analytical in some cases and be a little less emotionally reactive. That's been a big lesson. And that is, Machiavelli is all about analyzing, looking at the workplace like a chessboard instead of being like, how come you're paying Ralph more than me? He has less education and he produces less, and this is so unfair. Instead of saying like, okay, well, I know Ralph is making more than I am. I know there's more money available for this position. How do I get it? Which is more productive.
So I like that Machiavelli was sort of the lens for a lot of this. You talk a bit about him as sort of, he was never the person in the room with the most power. And that's why he made him a good negotiator. Talk a little bit about that for our viewers, our listeners, who might be thinking that the problem is really structural. It's not about personal power. It's just they need to read this, right? Talk about that. Give a little bit of advice from that lens, Stacey, because it's so powerful in the book.
Yeah, so I was just actually, as you're talking, I'm smiling because I have my very, very beat up copy of the Prince.
And his wonderful picture.
Yeah. So many times. So yes, Machiavelli, this was before Italy was a united country. It was broken up into city-states at the time. And Machiavelli was Florentine. He was from Florence. Florence was a little city-state. It was essentially a republic, more or less, functioning republic. It had a representative government. Machiavelli was very proud of that. A lot of the King of France owns bits of Italy. The Pope had an army. The Catholic Church had an army at that time. There were despots and kings and all kinds of things. Machiavelli was essentially the Secretary of State for Florence. And Florence had no army, and they did not have much money. So essentially, Florence was broke and not very powerful. And it was in a very strategic location. And also, a lot of cool things were happening in that city as far as art and technology at the time. So it did have some cachet, but it didn't have a lot of power. And so Machiavelli was sort of wheeling and dealing with all these kings and despots and popes. They all knew his name, but trying to basically convince them to do things or not do things, namely to not invade or take over or demand money. And he didn't really have much in the way of leverage. He had his wits. And I think my mind kept going back to that when I was talking about negotiating, because I think a lot of times what can be so scary about a negotiation is you go into it feeling like you don't have any power. Like, unless you have another job offer or are willing to quit, what do you say? Like, or else what? And I think that can make, at least it's for me, often made negotiating very scary. You walk in and it's like, well, I need more money.
Yeah, it is scary, right?
Playing it out of your head, and they're like, no, well, fine. I mean, that's a scary situation to go into. So I remember taking a lot of solace in the idea that Machiavelli was never the most powerful person in the room. He just wasn't.
But he knew, because of that, he had to do something different. When most people think of Machiavelli and you deal with this in the book, they think, oh my goodness, Stacey, wow, how could you pick Machiavelli? That's power by any means. And you say, no, that's not what I mean. So tell someone who might have that impression, Stacey, why Machiavelli? This is someone who you think about as being manipulative, using every power lever possible to trick people into getting what they want. But you say, no, that's not what I mean.
Oh, yes. Well, Yeah, calling someone Machiavellian is generally not a compliment. I think coming from me at this point, it would be.
Yes,
but,
yes, it would be after reading this book.
But even I know better. I apologize for all the background noise, by the way. I'm in the middle of New York, working from home, and we've got,
Oh, we're grateful that you're here between shows. No, thank you.
But yeah, I mean, I think to me, Machiavelli was above all things practical. He had grown up in Italy. It was a very violent time with the city-states. Power was changing hands constantly. Armies would come in and slaughter people and take things. And at one point when he was 9 years old, there was an attack on Florence. And when he wrote about it later, he said, the streets were filled with the parts of men. That was the city. He was 9.
Yeah.
So for him, the stakes were very high. If a prince failed, chaos happened. People died. There was blood in the parts of men in the streets. So for him, the law and order were sort of above all things. And he was just very strategic in the way he looked at things. He took emotion and morality out of it. In fact, I think the reason that Machiavelli has persevered all these years, and the reason we are so suspicious of him, are actually the same thing, which is that he does remove morality and emotion. So there is something timeless about the advice, because it is not dealing with an morality of the 1500s, but instead it's sort of like, okay, you want power, this is the obstacle in your way. What are some ways to deal with that obstacle? But also you end up with some kind of chilling pieces of advice, like, if you wrong someone, you should probably kill them and their entire family, because you don't want someone who's, angry at you rattling around. They'll plot against you eventually. So I don't think there's one without the other. I don't think we get the wisdom of Machiavelli without the horrificness of some of his advice.
And you're quite balanced in that book. You also take him into the negotiating room. So you relate a great story about being so excited about the salary and then finding out, wait a minute, tell our listeners that story and a little bit about what you would tell someone like an Adele Lim walking into this kind of negotiation. Talk a little bit about your own experience, what you learned a bit from Adele, and translate that for some of our viewers who might be saying, I need this advice, I'm going to go ask for something else.
So Adele Lim is a television writer for years and years, was the screenwriter for Crazy Rich Asians. Huge, hundreds of millions of dollars international hit.
Yeah.
And she found herself in a situation where she turned down writing the sequel to this hit movie that she'd written because of equal pay. I remember reading just a snippet of this story online somewhere, and I remember thinking, I have to talk to this woman. Talk to this woman. So she had put in almost 2 decades of television writing. She was a showrunner, and writers' rooms in Hollywood are just known for being very male and very, very white. Very bro-y, talking about sports and strip clubs, and it just goes downhill from there. Adele Lim was from Malaysia. So she is American now, but she had come from a different country. She hadn't come up through the U.S. school system, but she went to college in the U.S. and this is what she wanted to do. She wanted to tell stories. So she came out and basically had to, against all kinds of odds, fight her way up the very competitive food chain of TV writing. And then one day, she got asked to write Crazy Rich Asians. They had a script for it. It was this hit book, this best-selling book. It had been adapted for the screen, but it wasn't quite working. So she was asked to come and modify it. And she had all this knowledge of Asia. She said in the beginning, there's a great scene where Michelle Yeoh is at a Bible group with like super nice purse, and they're all talking about their kids and kind of bragging. And she said, my mom is in that Bible class. Like, I know that Bible class because my mom is in it. So she really brought a lot of the authenticity to the script. And, she was the writer on set. It was this huge hit. And then they came to her, and originally it had been written by a very experienced screenwriter who was a white man who wasn't as familiar with
Right.
Asian culture as Adele was. So Adele, they come to Adele to talk about writing Crazy Rich Asians 2 and 3, because it's been this huge hit, this critical hit, this box office hit, the romantic comedy's back, everything. And they offered her around $100,000
As a follow-up.
to write the sequel.
Right.
And her male co-writer got offered $800,000. And Adele said she thought it was a mistake, and then she thought it was like maybe a joke. Like it just seemed so outrageous to her. And her agent was like, no, they say because you don't have screenwriting experience. I mean, she'd been writing for television for like 15 years. But they said, no, you don't have screenwriting experience, so this is it. And the male co-writer offered to split his salary with her so that they would be equally compensated. But she said, no, this is not about the white guy making less. This is about me being equally acknowledged by the studio. But Warner Brothers said no, and she walked. And she said it was a lot of the reason had to do with her daughter, that she has a daughter. And she was like, I just kept thinking, what would I want my daughter to do in a situation like this? Where, I mean, because it's so hard to walk away from something like that. I mean, this huge hit, those hits don't come along all that often, but she's done very, very well since. She said she got thousands of letters from all over the world from women. Her mom, who was initially like really upset, obviously,
right.
She said is a working woman, and called up Adele and thanked her later. She said, so many times in my career, I felt like I was lucky to be at the table at all and just had to take what they gave me. And thank you for not accepting less than you should. I mean, that's a real act of courage and faith in a way, I think, that I don't know, it just has really stuck with me. It's one of my favorite stories in the book.
It's a terrific story, and it leads to some of your other advice to women entrepreneurs, women executives who might be listening to this, and you say to them, think more about Machiavelli in terms of, and I want you to talk a little bit about this, titles. The stuff you're asked to do. Hey, Stacey, could you organize the birthday party? Could you buy the gift for somebody's birthday? Talk a little bit about channeling Machiavelli. Tell our aspiring entrepreneurs, especially women, hey, this is what I don't want to give away the book too much because I want them to buy it from the link below. But tell them a little bit about how you would channel Machiavelli and sitting them down and saying, look, before you start, let me tell you these things.
You were referring to something that the legal scholar Joan C. Williams, who's an amazing author and thinker, has called office housework. So this often happens to women. I mean, it happens to everyone in the start of their careers, and I think that's where it can get confusing because we all have to pay our dues and do a little bit of grunt work early on in our careers. But what tends to happen is men will naturally evolve out of getting asked to do these tasks. And often women will continue to be asked. There are a bunch of different kinds of things. One is like ordering lunch, organizing parties, setting up meetings, logistical things, or, just kind of the less glamorous work women will continue to get asked to do that. And the problem with it is that it sucks up your time.
Right.
So that you don't have time to produce the kind of work that's actually going to propel you forward in your career. And it's a really serious issue. I mean, whatever planning, someone's going away party doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but those are hours that someone else can spend on, a bigger project, a proposal, an idea, a bunch of things. So there are some ways out of it. I think there are 7 or 8 that I identified because this resonated with me so much. And I started thinking of all these instances where I would get asked to do office housework. And often it's really hard to say no, or there will be sort of a verbal appreciation for this kind of work where it's like, oh, we so appreciate that you, take one for the team, but it's not going to get you promoted.
Right.
Office housework.
And so Machiavelli would tell us, hey,
yes.
Right.
So what Joan C. Williams advises, first of all, is like, do not ever volunteer for office housework. Ever, 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 ever. She says, even if you think like it's just faster if I do it, even if you think, oh, but it's just better if I do it for everyone, do not volunteer ever. So that's a big one. I mean, often it's very tempting to just be like, you know what, forget it, I'll do it. Do not, do not, do not. So that's one of the big ones. The second one is do it once and do it very graciously, and then don't do it again. So if it's something like, oh, hey, can you set up a meeting room for us? And let's say that takes like 20 minutes. So you do it the first time, and the next time it's like, oh, can you set up a meeting room for us? Be like, oh, I did do that last time, but I have all the information. Why don't I pass that along to Ralph, and he can set up the meeting this time? Right. So sort of set up a precedent, pass it along. The other thing you can do is like try to spin it to your advantage. So for instance, let's say you are asked to organize the meeting. So you set up place cards and sit yourself next to someone you've been wanting to meet, someone who could be a mentor to you.
Right.
Let's say it's hiring committees. I've been on about 1 million hiring committees. You find out what people make. You find out what your manager is looking for, what they're concerned about on your team, what they're hoping, what their goals are. So that can be incredibly valuable too. Or sometimes you just have to say no and take a hit. But according to Joan Williams, and in fact, according to Machiavelli, although it is Machiavelli very famously says, like, if you want to be feared and loved, but if you have to choose fear. And Joan Williams said the same thing. She's like, listen, it's very important, especially for women, to be liked in order to have support to advance and go into leadership positions. So it's very tricky. But she's like, if you've got to choose, take the hit to likability, because otherwise all of your time will get sucked away and everyone will like you and you will stagnate.
It's a terrific theme through this book. Thinking about Machiavelli and now having lived your professional life, what would you say, totally unfair question, but I'll ask it two ways. What's the hardest,
Go for it. Ask anything.
What's the hardest piece of advice to give? And what's the hardest piece, in your experience, of advice to receive?
A lot of the advice in this book is hard. A lot of it I didn't like giving. And the thing I told myself, Machiavelli is this quote that I would think of all the time, which is, since I am trying to write something that will be of practical use, I have decided to present things as they actually are rather than as they ought to be.
I love that. Yeah.
But we are dealing with an unfair system. We're dealing with discrimination, misogyny, unconscious bias, racism, all kinds of things. The system is problematic and flawed, and but it's the system we have, and we need to work with it, to work to change it, to work inside of it in certain cases. So how do you work in a system that is making all kinds of assumptions about you, your limitations, what you ought to be doing, if you look like a leader or not, if you have the right personality, if you're dressing the right way, all these things? How do you navigate that and still get where you want to go? The piece of advice that is my least favorite, is around motherhood. A lot of the advice around motherhood is really hard, but women, when they have children, the data just is devastating. There is a terrible pay gap between mothers and women who don't have children. It's larger than the gender pay gap, than the pay gap between women and men. When women have children, their earning potential goes down. They are often, it's called mommy tracking, but they're way less likely to get promoted. Their work is looked at more critically. The second they leave work for anything, it's assumed that they're less dedicated to their jobs. It is probably one of the most difficult kinds of discrimination to deal with, because a lot of it's done under the guise of people thinking that they're helping you out. It's like, Janice just had a baby. Let's give her a break. Let's not put her on that crazy project that's going to take all these millions of hours. We'll put her on this project. That'll be better for work-life balance. And so a lot of the antidote to that is being very direct and pushing back in a very direct way, but also kind of pretending like you don't have children, de-emphasizing that part of your life. I really hated saying this. I do not have children, and that made it worse. But like one of the pieces of advice, Dr. Cecilia Ridgway out of Stanford has done some really wonderful research on this. And she said, brace yourself. And she's like, don't talk about your baby. Just don't. Don't bring up the baby. Don't show millions of pictures of the baby. And the women I talked with pretty much all said the same thing. Sally Krawcheck, who's a Wall Street CEO, one of the women I profiled in the book, says she had a job offer, and the person, it was at a big bank, and the person who had offered her the job saw her on the sidewalk pushing her baby in a stroller and rescinded the job offer. I mean, wow, this is real.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Adele Lim said she's like looking back, she's like, I don't know. She didn't recommend doing this, but the way she handled it in the super male writer's room was, she said she didn't talk about her baby. She worked as hard as she had before she had a baby. She basically didn't sleep for 5 years. But I mean, I hated giving that advice. It's terrible advice, but we're dealing with a system in which the second you are seen as a mother and not as a worker, all kinds of things happen in the workplace. And I didn't want to pretend like that wasn't the case. And I didn't want to give no advice. So I mean, do you have to not show baby pictures? No, of course not. In fact, I have a baby, but just maybe be careful, discerning about it. I just wanted everybody to have the information and the research and to offer answers, even if those answers were not what I wish they were. And very, very often the answers were not what I wish they were.
It's very authentic advice. It's heartfelt. It's a terrific part of the book. Let's talk to some of the women who might be listening who are going to be pitching investors. You've talked about this in other platforms. The venture capital going to women founders is something like 2%, if that might be aggressive as well. What advice do you have for a woman founder, a woman technologist, a woman entrepreneur that comes from Machiavelli as she's thinking about her financing strategy?
Yes. So you're absolutely right. It's 2% of venture capital goes to women. And this is in spite of the fact that women now have started 40% of the businesses in our economy.
Right.
So they're starting 40% of the businesses getting 2% of the capital. So these businesses don't have a chance to grow. They stay tiny. And that is a huge problem because, we're losing out on all those ideas, those amazing ideas that could help our economy, help the whole economy grow. I mean, often I think we think of the economy as a zero-sum game. Like if women get more, men get less.
So well put. Yep.
But that's not the case. I mean, if there's one thing I can tell you, having covered the economy for 15 years, it's that when the economy gets bigger, it's better for everyone. A woman gets more than 2% of the venture capital. It means that her business grows, her product goes out there, she hires more people, the economy gets bigger, there's more venture capital. So that is the first thing I'd like to say. Advice for women, it's really hard out of the gate. Vivienne Ming is an AI scientist, and she has her own business, and she talked about raising money as a woman. And she said it was just really, really hard. She said, once you get the first round of funding and prove you're profitable, things get way easier. She said when she would make these presentations, they would not question the science. They loved the science. She said they just didn't want to give money to a person in a dress. So just know up front that you're going to encounter more skepticism than you would if you were a man. Prepare yourself for that is the advice I would give. Know that it is not your fault or the fault of your presentation. And I would say present as many facts as you can. Data, facts, that is the antidote to discrimination. Always. Transparency, data, facts. Discrimination lives in fog. It lives in impressions and feelings and gut feelings, and like, I just feel like Randy would be a little better in a leadership position than, Raina. I don't know. He just seems more like leadership material. That is where discrimination lives. So you present data. show as much data as you can, and push, and know that there's a much higher barrier to entry, but then it gets easier once you've proven yourself. Yeah. But it's really hard. And I would say also, like, you know, you're doing the Lord's work. I mean, it's so crucially important to get that capital, to grow that business, because, you know, women have a perspective on the economy and on people's needs and how to serve them that other people don't have. That's the same with, you know, people of color. That's the same with people in different socioeconomic classes, rural, urban. We all know intimately our world and what problems there are that we could solve. We know the needs of our own communities, and it's a service to raise money. So well
put. So well put. And to invest in. So your advice to women angel investors on the other side of this, women venture fund partners, you'd say to them, probably you give them similar advice about thinking, probably because they're successful, they're thinking a little bit about Machiavelli. What advice would you give them? And are you positive about overall, are you optimistic and positive about where we're headed?
So do I feel like we're heading in a good direction? I do. The reason that I'm optimistic right now is that I feel like right now workers have more power than they have at any time I've been covering the economy.
So
this
true.
Is across
right.
the socioeconomic spectrum. It's not just people who work in tech or people who are computer programmers or who have master's degrees or medical degrees. It is all across the economy. Companies are desperate to keep workers. They're desperate to hire workers. They're suddenly raising wages. They're also open to more flexible work, which is a huge deal for a lot of women, millions of whom dropped out of the workforce because of childcare and family care. And this is a huge thing that takes women out of the workforce. Employers are suddenly much more flexible, much more open to trying different things. I think partly because of the pandemic and partly because they really need warm bodies. So workers have a lot of power. This is a moment to ask for more. This is a moment to look around for something new. This is a moment to make a jump. And a lot of people are doing that. I mean, we're in the middle of what's being called the Great Resignation. I think people are starting to realize their power. And I think it's because we have an unprecedented amount. I mean, it may be precedented, but certainly not in the last 40, 50 years of workers having power. More women, more people of color are starting businesses right now. The venture capital going to them has actually dropped. But this is kind of a funny beauty of the free market moment. All of these startups are now getting funding, startups that lend money to people.
Right.
So even though venture capitalists might not give money to, you know, women,
they're only one source. They're only one source.
They will give money to startups that will lend money to women and minorities. So it is one of the sort of beautiful, you know, moments. There's a huge demand. Yeah. Women and people of color are starting businesses like mad, and that is very exciting to me. And, you know, as unfair as the American economy is, it's an amazing force. I love studying it, and it is powerful if you can harness it. And there's a lot of demand for money right now, and that demand is being met.
It's a great time for a very thoughtful book, and that's often what propels them. I know a lot of people are going to read this. Stacey, tell us, from any genre, what are you reading? What are you watching? What do you recommend? I want people to buy this book. I'll give them a moment to click the link below this and buy Machiavelli for Women. But what are you reading and what are you thinking about? What do you recommend?
So actually, I am laughing at myself. So for 3 years, all I read were books with titles like Framed by Gender. Like everything I read was, you know, there was no pleasure read.
Same lens, yeah.
And so the book that I have just finished is Call of the Wild.
Oh,
I just
wonderful.
read Call of the Wild.
Yeah.
I think I was craving nature, and I don't know, something it's from the point of view of a dog. It's very interesting. And it's during the sort of the gold rush in Alaska. So that is what I have been reading. And it really feels like this breath of fresh air to read fiction. And of course, all I can see is economics because my brain is overtrained at this point. So I'm like, oh, the gold rush. And it's weirdly been making me think of the Netflix show that I've been watching along with a lot of other people, which is Squid Game.
Yes, Squid Game.
It's very intense. It is not for the faint of heart,
Yeah.
but it's also all about economics and like what debt and the promise of money does to people and how it can kind of strip their humanity away. So I've been thinking a lot about that. Even when I try to relax, I end up thinking about economics. But,
Of course. Well, it's wonderful. Stacey, where can people learn more? Is there a website? I know that, of course, they're going to be listening to you on the Indicator and the like, but other places you'd point out, a website that you like, things where people can follow you on Twitter. Talk a little bit about folks who want to engage a bit more directly with you or learn more.
Thank you. I am on Twitter way too much. My handle is @SVanekSmith. I also have a website, StaceyVanekSmith.com. I did not get very creative with that. So yeah, I mean, those are the two main places. Then of course, NPR, The Indicator. I'm there every day. Every day I'm on The Indicator. So.
Well, we're so grateful for you spending some of your time with us. The book is Machiavelli for Women. Please get it. Stacey Vanek Smith, thank you. And let's hope even more folks enjoy this book after today.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.